Okay, let's get started. It's my great pleasure to be able to moderate this conversation between three excellent writers, thinkers, critics, and also three great mothers. So I know Rachel, right? Well, I know Rachel has co-edited a book titled "Dangerous Ideas About Mothers." The very title, "Dangerous Ideas About Mothers," is somewhat counterintuitive, right? Dangerous ideas. So I'm wondering whether we could begin our conversation with the topic of motherhood, and whether you would like to, you could, share with us in what ways being a mother has influenced your thinking, writing, or your career, your life trajectory? Or maybe we can begin with Rachel?
Sure. Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. So my colleague Camilla Nelson and I wanted to edit a book about interesting and dangerous ideas about mothering and motherhood, because we feel that often the discussion around mothers is either very instructive, as in you're told what to do, or it's very negative, as in you're a bad mother, or some people are good mothers and some people are bad mothers. And I don't know what it's like in China, but I do know in Australia, in the UK and in the USA, there's recently been a real intensification of the focus on mothering and the role of the mother. And also, we wanted to deconstruct that idea. So motherhood, not just as a relationship with someone you care for, but also as a cultural construct. In the way that, say, feminism has deconstructed the idea of gender. And so we wanted to look at the idea of motherhood not as something natural, instinctive, that suddenly happens when someone gives birth to a child or adopts one or looks after a younger sibling, but rather something that's created culturally and is used to, in many cases, to control women and their choices in life. So I started getting interested in motherhood and writing about it when my son was young and he was diagnosed with a disability. So I've written about it from that context. So I have a personal experience of writing about being a mother. And then I've also trying to look at it now as a cultural critique of the ideas of who does what care in our households and in our nations.
Josephine, I know you have contributed a piece to this book, right? Maybe you can comment on that and also your experience as a mother and a writer.
Thank you. And thank you, Rachel. And I responded very warmly and enthusiastically to this proposal, which I think is a wonderful collection of works that try to speak beyond academia, which I think is one of the strengths of this book. It is not just academic discourse with footnotes. There's an investment that the writers have in what they're writing about. So we write often from personal experience, but we also bring in sometimes our training, our thoughts as writers, perhaps as academics, perhaps as cultural commentators. So I think it's a really great collection for that reason. My essay is about, I have two children, one of whom is a biological son, one of whom is an adopted child. So, and my adopted daughter is from Guangdong province. She is from a small town outside Guangdong. So my experience was, my essay doesn't seek to be incredibly autobiographical in the sense of I pour out the story. And I was keenly aware that as a 14-year-old nearly, that this story is also my daughter's story. And one must be very aware when one writes about one's children that one's children grow up and become adults. And I feel that she has to claim this story. So I wrote it very carefully. But really it tells the story of how the fears I had as a woman, as a potential mother of another child, that I might not be able to love this child in the same way as I love my biological son. So the dangers of adoption from a country which is not where we are born. We are not Chinese, neither my husband nor I. So the story is a dangerous one. The experience feels dangerous. It feels perilous. It feels arbitrary. You're at the mercy, you feel, of the CCAA in Beijing, which is the council, the government department which allocates children to prospective adoptive families from overseas. You have no choice. You do not meet the child until the day that you travel to China and stand in a government office, and they enter and they hand the child to you and you do all the forms. You have seen a photograph and medical reports. But what I was interested in was the way that in natural motherhood, we repress the fears. Many things can happen in pregnancy and childbirth and beyond. We cannot control this, and yet so often policies set out to control this. And my story is really both a very comforting one, I feel, to talk about adoption as a perfectly legitimate way of forming a family, and that there is no difference in how I feel. We feel, my husband and I, about our children, but that along the way I talk about the fears that I had, the ambivalences that this child might not love me. That so-called natural idea of falling in love with a child is very different when an infant is little. When a child is nearly 3, is extremely traumatized, doesn't understand a word of English, has been in an institution without attentive care. With care, she was fine, but she was not fine because she hadn't had constant care. And so this brings with it many issues, and it's very challenging, but it could be overcome with love and with becoming a mother and a parent of a child. Yeah.
Right. Indeed, there are several ideas and dangerous ideas indeed about motherhood. And I totally agree that mothering is not natural. It has to be learned. So as I grew up, I have watched the mothers around me and trying to learn mothering from them. Probably you wouldn't believe that I could not recollect being praised by my mother. I'm not saying my mother is cold. She is very nice, very kind, and all self-denying. When it comes to our needs, you always put our need first. But she's this kind of Chinese parent who is modest. She said, I remember there's one incident when I was 7 or 8. I didn't perform well at school. So once I got into the top 20th rank in my class and was so overwhelmed, I ran home and told her outside, she was outside shopping. I came upon her in the street and I told her the good news. She, although I could sense that she was pleased, she said to me harshly, she said, wait until we get home and see what lesson I'll give you. You are lagging behind. And I thought, no, I have improved. So I have been observing women around me to see the kind of mothers they are. So as I grew up, I never, unlike many of the heroines in romantic novels who always aspire to become perfect mothers or perfect wives, I never really, in the several, in some of the relationship I had, I never aspired to, oh, I so very much want to have a child with you. No, it never occurred to me to intentionally become a mother. Yet when in 1997, as I was married and became pregnant, incidentally, I started to think a lot of issues beyond me. And curiously, as we were freshly moved to Shanghai, one piece of the furniture I had, which was a solid wood table, as my tummy began to grow in size visibly, I also noticed that there was a white dot on the surface of the table appearing larger and larger by month. And eventually I noticed that there was a caterpillar inside, trying to eat its way out. And I had this incredible feeling that I can draw an analogy between that caterpillar and the baby in me. Because I was worried that of the responsibility that would be befalling on me, I would be eaten up. So I think that fear speaks of a dangerous stereotype of all the virtues a young mother, a mother must have to be considerate and loving, caring, putting all the families as priority. For me, probably I wanted to resist that, although I'm not sure if I have been keeping a good balance or not. But certainly mothering or motherhood has to be learned, and it has to be learned rather consciously to know the kind of support we can give to our children, especially the kind of woman we remain to be. We are not just mothers, we are us, right? We have our own work, and mothering is just one aspect of our being. So it has been quite a journey, but I don't think it's necessary for everyone to go on this journey. So every girl aspires to be a mother. That too is a dangerous notion.
Oh, yes, just a quick comment. I think, Rachel, you can get ready for editing the second volume of your book, and it can be titled Caterpillars and Mothers.
Exactly. That's a great story. Yeah. I was going to say about the idea that, you know, women are expected to do certain things, and nowadays in Australia certainly, young women are expected to get a job and earn their own living. They're also expected to form a partnership. Often they're expected to have children, though many women are choosing now not to be. But when you do choose not to have children, often as a woman you're questioned, why didn't you have a child? Why don't you have children? And I also have a friend who has 6 children, and in Australia that's a lot. But in Australia most people might have 1, 2, 3 children. But because she has 6, she's always criticised, you have too many, that was too greedy. And a woman who has none, you are very selfish because you don't have any children. And it's amazing that sometimes those words are used about men who do or don't have children, but I don't think they're described as selfish. I think those men are focused on their careers. So it's really interesting to notice how now there is, even though feminism and women's liberation in Australia has actually freed women to be much freer in making their choices, there is now an increasing pressure on them to knuckle down and have children and go back to the home. So it's a return to the home. So I love what you said, Professor Liu, about we're also still women, because sometimes once you get named as a mother, you somehow lose that you're a person. And I particularly notice it in my own case as a mother of a child with a disability. So although he's 19 now, he's quite grown up, he also still needs a lot of caring. And so I've been named as a mother or a carer, and people no longer see me often in myself as a real person, a woman, a worker. What I'm seen as someone who looks after my son partly. So I'm always seen in relation to him. And although his father is very caring and supportive, he's not seen in relation. People say, oh, isn't it wonderful that he's helpful?
Okay, so moving on from the perspectives of mothers to the perspectives of women and persons. So Virginia Woolf writes in A Room of One's Own that a great mind is androgynous. And in her diary, she also remarks that when I write, I'm a sensibility, seeming to downplay the gender specificity or difference or consciousness, well, depending on how you read it, for a writer. So I'm wondering, can you share with us your own experiences as writers, critical and creative? Or more specifically, when you write, do you think you are inhabiting and conveying decidedly women's points of view?
I think it depends what No, I mean, I basically don't believe that there is an essential feminine female style. I have no, I'm much more interested, I think, in the way that writing is formed through craft and, yes, imagination, and, you know, it's a more much, but for me, what I write about, or what I'm interested in writing about, often is informed, I think, by my politics and or by what what I'm interested in exploring or trying to understand. And often I think that is inexorably informed by movements like feminism and awarenesses that I have. But I don't myself ascribe to a kind of essential female It was a very popular idea in the 80s in America. There was a lot of this kind of discussion and, you know, this whole essentialism debate. And I do though believe that the passions that I have are informed by my history in my body and the way I've been, the way I've experienced life as a woman, as a human, yes, but being gendered very often in various ways, either through motherhood or in the workplace or in my struggles to establish myself outside of structures like universities, to be independent. All of these things I feel that I've been limited by being a woman. And I do, and I know that because I have 3 brothers who are highly successful, very quite wealthy people with engineering businesses, and my pathway into humanities led me down a very, very different trajectory. And I don't regret that, but I remember distinctly I was very good at maths and science, my father saying, "Oh, your strength is in languages, Josephine, and literature." And I sort of nodded my head and off I went. And I don't think it was as arbitrary as that, but I think it was history and the time that I was growing up and my family structure that drove me down. And I feel that.
Yes, I totally agree. I do not think, well, as a scholar teaching in women's writing, I always bear a grudge when asked, "Professor, do you think that women write in certain ways? Or are there genres that women writers should write in particular genres, but women writers should conform to certain writing techniques or features?" I think I can never suppress my anger when I got such kind of question. Because I think the stereotyped notion that women writers write nothing but parties in the fashion of Jane Austen or the Brontes, that kind of stereotype thinking is related to how literary history was written. How women of the 18th or the 19th century, the kind of access they had to writing and reading to the public readers. So right now, I do not think that women writers should confine themselves to particular genres. I remember once we were debating, my students and I were debating if women make good science fiction writers or detective story writers, because these are the 2 genres that are so male. So they think women are not good at science, so they are better at domestic fiction. So, of course, we are all very aware of Agatha Christie or P.D. James. Therefore, I could not subscribe to the notion that the essentialist notion that women write in certain language, in certain subject matters. I think this is more like a personal choice. Sometimes, but our choice, we are formed by our circumstances. We are conditioned, or sometimes preconditioned into certain preferences. But if we can keep a critical distance as to how we form our taste of reading, how we cultivate our craft of writing, we may be able to cross some of the conventional stereotypes of women writers.
Thank you. Yes, I agree with what both of you have said there. What I will add to it is the idea that women may be constrained by their gender because of this the structural systemic systems of the gateways, for example, book publishing. Often important decision makers in book publishers have been men, and so women have been encouraged to write certain types of books because those men are saying, well, we can sell that. We can sell historical romance novels by a woman because you can have your picture on the cover dressed in a really good dress. But we can't sell a really complex literary novel as well by a woman necessarily. Now, obviously that has changed very much. And Josephine, you are an incredibly successful author now and a winner of Australia's most prestigious prize for fiction was won by your book Extinctions last year. So we know that when women write well and they are published, they can get out there and they can be appreciated. And so this is changing, but there are still some systemic barriers for women, I think, in Australia and many other countries. In terms of how I personally write, I almost always write non-fiction or memoir, so I write essays that are autobiographical, they're based on my life, but they also are about more general things to have universal appeal. So I am almost always starting from something personal. So I'm starting from where I am and the specifics of who I am. That includes my gender. It's not necessarily the most important thing about me. Also my education, my privilege. I do live a privileged life as an academic in Australia, and a whole lot of other things that I experience. So I'm always starting from the personal, and so that notion of the body, writing is embodied, and I think for me, my best writing comes from starting from that personal and then looking out, reaching out and pulling back in.
Thank you very much. Just a quick addition. So I remember once I was teaching Hannah Arendt a selection from his book on culture and the past and the future, and a couple of female students in my class were very enthusiastic about the text. They said, "Oh, this is really good, and she's such a great writer." And I was so encouraged. I asked them why, and they said, "Oh, she writes like a man." That's very unusual. That's very rare. You don't see many writings by female like this. Very philosophically profound and intellectually enriching. So they were surprised, actually, that this kind of text was written by a woman.
Can I say that having spent 2 months in Shanghai as a guest of the Shanghai Writers Centre with the group, one of the things that I really found most interesting or moving was to slowly learn about the conditions that women are in China, in contemporary world, in a very modern, privileged city, space of Shanghai. It is, it's supposed to be the future is here, And to hear the stories about some of the issues around, obviously I'm very interested because our whole family, in a sense, is formed by the one-child policy. We have a child because of the one-child policy. Obviously, the story is opaque because it's difficult to unpack that story with the language problems and also the opacity of documents and archives, and the process that we went through is not made very transparent in China. And so I feel that I came and I looked everywhere at women. Do they have one child? What do they feel about this thing about two child? And I think how policed or how managed your bodies are. And, I met a woman at the FASIC conference, and she was an academic at a lunch, and she said, when we went there, we were all given a schedule for when they wanted us to have our children, so that they wouldn't be down on, the staff numbers wouldn't be reduced if the women, and that they prefer to hire women who've already had their children. And if a woman wanted to have a cesarean, her husband has to sign the form for the cesarean. And these things for me are shattering, quite shattering to hear. And I think these are the stories that I feel, I feel the dangerous ideas about women, and I think these are really contemporary issues. And that isn't to say that Australia is perfect. It certainly isn't. And I feel like I'm coming, you know, I don't want to sound like, well, you know, I think you should do this. But I think because our daughter came through as a result of this system, which now seems so arbitrary, because now they want everyone to have 2 children. How does that feel, you know, to be one child and then suddenly, oh, now you know, and if you don't have 2, maybe we're going to tax you if you have none. You know, like how do, and obviously families have always been, motherhood has always been policed, and motherhood has always been the subject of laws, and in our country as well. It may be more hidden. And, you know, there's ideologically, you know, the Catholic family was supposed to be big because women had no contraception. So you'd have 6, 7, 8, 10 children, babies dying. You know, some of the families you're in Ireland were huge, and the death rate terrible. And also in China you had this as well. So I feel that motherhood, while it's a sentimental category, is also a very powerful field.
Well, as I just said, as I first realized that I was going to be a mother, my first concern was this desire to preserve a sense of self-autonomy. Yet gradually, as I got a hand at being a mother, motherhood enables me to look beyond my own needs. I began to examine the kind of world, the kind of protection that I can offer my son. So for today's conversation, I dug up one of the old poems I wrote when my son was little. So probably it would give you some ideas of a young mother's state of mind, how frustrating or the kind of feelings that she has harbored in envisioning the kind of world that the son would be living in. So the first poem was written when my boy was 6 years old. The title is The World of a 6-Year-Old Boy. His world operates not with Darwinian laws. His toys prophesize a future when animals transform into mighty humanoid warriors, evolving into higher order as they grow. I want to be whichever the most strong. His world obeys not Newtonic principles. He wants to jump high and fly, much the way dinosaurs became birds at that split nanosecond, much the way the little butterfly-like girls and boys of his storybooks take flight. I want to be a doctor who puts wings to our back. Yet what is his world made of? Matter and antimatter of some sorts. 8 to 5 routine, 5 days a week, plus the piano instructor on Friday eve and the private tutor Saturday morning. His vision is black and white, pencil and paper, every single stroke and slash etched into his absorbent, concentrating eyes. Sometimes they look tired and bored. His hearing is numerical, mechanical, fine-tuned to the frequency of math and literacy. Calculate and repeat the following after the beep. Beep. That's the study tape. The beep beeps, and my heart screams, an invisible shriek of terror. I want to wrestle a shadow, a foe that makes my son grow. Smart or not, grow he shall. His world, or worlds, that can be clicked open or closed swiftly at the upper right corner when you see the red cross, admits no distressed visitors like me, his mom. In his world, there is no pet and grants, deli outside the reach of spoils and nags. In his world, most families live in mid-air, and grounds means watching for traffic and darting spits. In his world is a dog-eat-dog world, so dynamic and oxymoronically fragile. No doubt he does have to transform, but how? I mourn for the loss of my son's childhood. So this is, I think the poem expressed my frustration for the kind of childhood I provided for my son, because we live in residential towers, so high up. After school, as he came back home, In the evening, he was up and there he stayed until the next morning. So outdoor activity was luxury, pets, impossible. And as we were migrants to the city, we didn't have family connections. So probably this is the kind of frustration that new families in the city would face in terms of they are envisioning, they are trying to figure out the kind of environment that would be beneficial for children. Another short poem is about, it's interesting, but it's violent as well because I got so mad. It expressed my sense of anger. I got so mad, I just wanted to stuff a hanky in his mouth to make him stop crying while I slapped his butt. He got so mad, he just kept rubbing off the crooked eights and repeated drawing and erasing, crumbling the pages and the booklet. So simple a task, so smooth a curve that shapes a number 8, yet so impossible for a 6-year-old who fears teachers' discontent and public shame. So tough a job, withholding anger that split the tongue and shakes the hands. My hissing cancels out all the love and sweetness a mother can give. And his dogged stupidity demonizes childish obsession and frustration and me. But when I flung his book aside and bid him to go to bed, in darkness, in tears, and blocked nasal sobs, he so soon fell asleep and looked so tranquilly, heart-rendingly vulnerable and adorable, even for his fault, even for my guilt. So being a mother is tough. It helps you to think beyond yourself. You have to think about what you can do to make the world better.
Indeed, thank you so much. And maybe we can revisit the question about writing and women from a different perspective. Professor Lu specializes in feminist theories and gender studies, and she has been teaching a number of courses on these subjects. So maybe, and I think Josephine also mentioned some influences of feminist theories and schools of thought. So maybe you can comment on how such theories, especially specific ones, that have enriched or encumbered your experiences of writing and teaching and research. Right?
You want me to start? Thank you. So I was very influenced by the 1980s French feminists, which were French feminist theorists who developed that idea of the écriture féminine, the idea of that Josephine was talking about earlier, that women might have a particular style. So when I was younger, I was very keen on those. And over time, I realised that that was not an enthusiasm that would remain with me. So I think I have moved on a little bit. But also at a very young age, I was very influenced. When I was in my 20s, I worked in London at a publisher called Virago Press, which was one of the early feminist publishers. And I was just one of their assistants. So I didn't make decisions. I wasn't an editor. I was just learning the trade as a new graduate young woman then. But that was very influential, and I met lots of really amazing writers. They reprinted old classics, particularly Anglo writers, and then they also introduced a whole diverse range of women's writing. And one of the writers that I was fortunate to meet when we published her book was Grace Paley, who's a very well-known American short story writer and poet, and she was a great activist. And so that was an example of both a theory that I thought was going to be really useful, the écriture féminine, and then a real live writer who came to London, and because I worked at the publishing house, I got to know her, and also Maya Angelou, a Black American poet, and who wrote a series of autobiographies, and Virago published them in the UK. And so they were really inspiring women and feminists to read in my 20s. And I think I was really influenced by them, not in a direct way. I would never claim that I've been able to write anything that, but that idea that Grace Paley had of writing in the voice of the people from her family's background and in the place where she lived, but always thinking that any time you write about women's lives, you're writing politically. You must, because our lives are personal is political. She really showed that to me in her work. And she also had a lovely way of talking. So she published 3 collections of short stories and a number of collections of poetry, but she lived quite a long time. She died not long ago. And she was often asked, why don't you write more? When are you going to write a novel? And she said, life is so short and art is so long. And I like that phrase because I think now it's made me aware I should only write what I need to write. I shouldn't waste my time writing things that are not of interest to me or valuable in some other way. So I guess I've been less influenced by feminist theory than I once thought I would be, and more by women writers. And there are many others I could mention. And in Australia, we have a lot of inspiring women. And, just one example would be Helen Garner. Another is Drusilla Majeska, 2 non-fiction writers in Australia who I absolutely love, who are probably 10, 20 years older than me, who I really aspire to. And a close friend and colleague, Liz Bursky, who writes very different sort of work from me, wonderful fiction, but who I'm inspired by when I talk to her. So that's not a theory, I guess people have inspired me more.
Thank you. I was just listening. I love Grace Paley too. When you think about inspiration, you think, you should go to the books you've read and the writers, and I can think of that. But when the question of feminism and politics, I think for me, feminist ideas really helped me to understand my mother. And that was probably the gift, the greatest gift, was to understand how my mother and my father and our family, and why my mum was like the way she was, and why my dad was like the way he... it gave me keys to understanding. And that helped me deal with a lot of anger I felt towards my parents and a lot of conflict in our family. And it wasn't that it kind of, my mother is oppressed, therefore she's off the hook. It wasn't like that at all. It became a question for me of, why does my mother feel she has no agency? Why is my mother is constantly... We have this saying in Australia, the burnt sausage syndrome. The sausage is a meal that is often used to be served. They're those thin... And your mother was the one or the burnt chop. Your mother would give everybody the good stuff, and she'd say, I'll have the burnt one. Don't worry about me. This kind of terrible way of self-abnegation that my mother had, and that mothers often do have, and I think we all still might be guilty of this. But the thing is, it made a lot of sense to me. That was really what it was. It wasn't like, I was under the kind of influence of an occult ideology that was going to kind of like take over my life and turn me into this kind of sort of Stalinist, feminist kind of activist. It was more that it really helped me to understand things and not to work them out, and like I said, not to forgive, but to understand. And I think my first novel, Cusp, which I didn't write till I was working on it in my 30s, and I was also doing a lot of work in performance art and visual art, theatre performance, and writing and things. And really, my first novel was, I decided, would be an anti-Bildungsroman. It would be a novel that begins not with the idea of leaving the novel of education, the European idea that the man, has to travel and discovers himself on this journey. And, rather that my book, unlike the colonial narrative in Australia, would begin with a girl who has been living in New York, who is forced to come home, whose mother wants her to come home. So it begins not with departure, but with arrival. And so for me, the underlying structure of that novel, or the logic of what I was trying to do, I didn't want to make the book about that, but it really helped me to think about why my story was the way it was, because it was challenging the idea that a woman has to symbolically kill her mother and escape in order to find herself. So it was a challenge to that idea and other things as well. So, yeah.
Yes. Feminism is an acquired perspective in my own case because when I was a college girl, I wasn't taught this course. There was no such course when I was growing up. But as I was growing up, I have seen enough sad stories, women's stories. Women are caught in miserable marriages, or women who are broken-hearted because of their lousy relationships, or women who had great hopes and dreams, yet simply because of their gender, they were told that they have to give up hopes. So later, as I went to Britain to study feminism, it has enabled me to understand, yes, myself, my parents, my family history, or the history of my culture. It has also enabled me to look at things anew. It's a perspective. And so theories, they are different notions, different arguments. I think I benefit most from several, rather than the metaphysical, the abstract notions that I think it's rather the social endeavors and contributions our mothers who had done that has made great impact on me, like the suffragettes. When I first read the stories of the suffragettes, I was amazed. I thought, wow, these women, they did try so hard to fight for voting right, even to the degree of, hunger strike or setting fire on some of the telephone booth, for instance. Or some of the stories of, say, Rebecca West, that is also an inspiration, how a woman so young and talented and bright, who was a journalist, and yet would not confine herself to conventionality, social conventionality. Her life definitely was not without controversy, but she bore it out with courage, and that was quite some inspiration, quite inspiring. And later, as I read about Germaine Greer, there was also they have given me a lot of courage as well. So, but if we have to talk about feminist theories, I think Judith Butler's notion that gender as performativity of gender, I think that is also liberating, that we do not need to confine ourselves into a polarized notion of being a woman, you should behave in this way, or being a man, you should.
Who in China are the women that you uphold as a feminist? Who are the Chinese women that you would cite in to uphold?
Who I would recognize as feminist?
Yes. Is there someone a writer that you would, or
The definition of feminist would be problematic because I would say the self-independent, autonomous woman can qualify to some degree as a feminist, but like 10 or 20 years ago, there was this young woman writer who writes a lot about women's body, what we call the body writing, the body writers. Wei Hui. She has stirred quite some sensation because she writes explicitly about sex. And I do not think that writing about sex would qualify as a feminist writing. So I can't answer your question, sorry, Josephine, but women who are willing and capable of expressing views, especially pointed out inequality or the stereotyping notions of gender as we find in our world, they are doing some work here.
Yeah, because I find a lot of young women quite outspoken and quite clear-sighted about the issues that they face.
Can we go back to an earlier comment Josephine made? And also this is related to another book by Rachel. So Josephine, you mentioned when you were writing about that piece about your daughter and the experience of adoption, you mentioned this tricky nature of an autobiography, right? It's personal and not. You don't want to be too personal. You mentioned some scruples about your daughter growing up and the reading days, and this is a story about her too. So and Rachel, in your memoir, right? It's called Reaching 1000. I think you also were in some reviews. I think there are also comments on about this tendency toward collapsing, or the boundary between the real, the personal, the real, and the fictional, right? So, and I think that's related to what you have been very invested in, the genre of life writing. So I wonder whether you can comment on that.
Yes, so in the field of life writing, which is generally considered to be writing about a life, a biography, someone else's life, or your own life, autobiography, or memoir, which might be a section of a life, is the field that I do my research in, and it's also what I generally write. But it's complex to write about yourself, because you can't just write your own story without writing other people's. And particularly if you're writing, I wanted to write my memoir, the story of what I learnt from being a mother of my son. But if I write about what I learnt as a mother, inevitably I must write about my son. And so I had a lot of issues and questions about privacy. Who owns this story? Do I own it? Does he? Do we share it? How do I get his consent? When I started writing, he was only about 5 or 6. And so if I'd said, can I write about your life? He would say yes, because I'm his mother, and he would still probably say that at 19. But because I wanted not to share things of his life that later he might regret. So it's a similar story to Josephine's, really, in the chapter in the book. So I had to develop a range of ways to think about that, and I think it's always a case with life writing, and I decided to stick always to the autobiographical, not to fictionalise anything. And if I wanted to not write something, I would just say so. So I'd say something like, I'm not going to say what happened next, or something like that, because then I'm being honest with the readers. I'm saying, this is my truth as I understand it, but I'm not telling you everything, because that might upset other people. Because, of course, it's not just my son. There's my husband, who's now my ex-husband, and there's other family members who are mentioned. So I also got my family to read the manuscript and say if they thought it was okay with them, and if they thought I was doing anything that was contrary to my son's best interests. So obviously I didn't want to write anything that would upset him. But I was still really worried. And when I got the first copies from the publisher, I had talked to my son about it, and he was about 13 then when it first came out, and I brought them home and I showed a copy to him, and I said, you can have this copy. And he took it into his bedroom and closed the door, and there was this silence, and I went and knocked on the door after about 10 minutes and said, is everything okay? And he said, I'm reading. And then I shut the door, and then half an hour later I was like, is everything okay? And he said, I'm reading. And I said, you can keep that book. You don't have to read it now. This is your copy. And he said, Mum, I think if you had had a book written about you, you would want to read it straight away. So I was like, okay, I get that. So he read it. He read bits of it. He says, I'm sorry, Mum, I skipped all the boring bits, which is all the stuff about your life, Mum, and your feelings and everything, all the stuff about autism, but I just read the bits about me. And there are bits that his copy has been read so often it's fallen apart. And sometimes he's come back to me as he's got older and said, you know how you said this? You said, Mum, I was really sad because I wondered such and such. Why did you say that? So there are things that sometimes it's quite confronting, and sometimes I felt quite sad when he's read bits back to me. But it's also, he sees it as something like a family photograph album. But I also tried to give him the last word in some way. So the final chapter, I'm writing about the fact that I'm writing about my son, and I read him a bit, and he then, which is true, I read him bits as I was writing, and he responds and says, "No, you're wrong, Mum. You've misunderstood something, and this is what I think, and this is my way." And so I put that in the book so that the last chapter is me saying, well, I've told you all this and it's my truth, but my son is saying, you've got that wrong. This is the real story. So I kind of try to give him some power at the end. And I think it's worked out okay. He doesn't hate me for it. But I actually don't know. And it's always something I think about. But I felt like I wanted to change people's views of someone with autism or a disability. I wanted to put a perspective that we might call neurodiversity. I wanted people to understand that just because you have a disability and you're different, it doesn't mean your life is any less or that you're worth any less. You're actually worth more. And by telling his story and my story, that was the purpose behind it. So I had that bigger goal, but I never wanted that to be at the cost of my son's embarrassment or discomfort. So I hope it's worked out, but I'll never really know. But I did promise him I wrote nothing about him after he reached about 12 or 13. And I said, he can kind of write. And I said, you can write your story now. That's up to you. So it was that same thing that you said, Josephine, that your daughter's story is hers. And I think we each own shares in other people's stories because no life is solitude. But if you're going to be a writer, you have to be careful not to exploit your position as a writer. And it's tough. I don't know if I did the right thing, but I thought and worried about it a lot. Sorry if that was a long answer.
Well, may I ask a question to Josephine and Rachel, as you two are writers? I am also very interested in life writing. I have been writing diaries since young, and I have also been researching on my grandfather's diary, autobiography, and my mom's diaries. Myself, in my own creative writing, of course, writing for me is quite personal. As Rachel has said, we always start from the personal approach. But as sometimes I find myself expressing sentiments or even angers towards, in a relationship, there are all sorts of things that will get on your nerve. And sometimes I find that exactly this is the sensitivity of those subject matters, like my anger towards my father, for instance, or my discontent towards my husband, for instance, that has kept me away from making my writing public, publishing my writing. So how would you respond to this kind of, I would not call it self-censorship, but indeed, as Rachel has mentioned, when I'm doing my own writing, I cannot keep away from having my families involved. So how would you make a balance about that?
Rachel's probably a better place to talk about that. I think I'm interested in what you say, because I think that for me, my book Extinctions came out of a period where both my parents became ill, and my mother-in-law, all in this period. And it was an extremely difficult time. And I don't know if I could have written that book when my parents published that book when my parents were alive. It's not autobiographical. It's not about my parents. Yet, the historical conditions and the issues I deal with, I feel would, I think, in one way I think I wish they could have read it and known that it was a success. On another level, I feel that I needed the distance in order to write it. So the other thing I'd say is that one of the things I struggle with in writing that essay, which I agreed to, I remember when I agreed to it, And then it sort of suddenly I started getting emails like, oh my God, I'm going to have to finally write this thing. And, you know, ever since we went through the adoption, I'd talk about it and friends would say, you must write about this. And, you know, I resist that compulsion. You know, there's a whole genre now of memoir, the sort of bleeding heart, you know, I was, you know, this happened to me and this is my story. These sort of unmediated, these kind of, to me, they're like kind of like you capitalize upon experience and you bundle it up and you can sell it. And there's this huge memoir movement. You know, there's all these things that have gone on around these things. So I've always resisted the kind of first person. And in fact, my book and the essay, actually, if you pass it to me, I'll just read the first line. The first line of my essay, when I tried to, in the motherhood book. Yeah, this one. I'll just find, I don't know what page I'm even on. Oh, there it is. So my essay is called Once Upon a Time in Motherland. And, you know, I don't know what the Mandarin, I don't think you have, in French you say Lu Lian, there was once. It's the classic kind of way of beginning, signalling that this is a fairy story, you know, like a kind of fiction. So it says, if this were a fairy tale, it might begin like this. Once upon a time, there was a man and a woman and a little boy who lived in a nice little house in a nice part of town, close to the beach and the train. They were very happy, but they felt something was missing in their lives. They wanted another child, but try as they might, the woman could not fall pregnant a second time. The woman and man were sad that there was no sibling for their son, although to tell the truth, he seemed perfectly happy. They decided to adopt a child from overseas, where, they believed, there were millions of impoverished orphans who needed nice homes. The family went through all kinds of adventures and overcame all kinds of adversities, but eventually their dream came true and they were able to travel to China to meet their daughter. Or this. Once upon a time there was a baby girl born in a small village in China to a woman and man who were kind but poor. The woman loved the infant upon sight, but her husband was a practical man. We already have one child, he said, pointing at their sleeping older son, and we do not have the money to pay the hukao for this second baby, and we do not want a a child born out of, what is the word in Mandarin? The word for a child who's outside. We do not want a heise. Okay. Besides, she is a girl. We must take her to the walled garden and leave her there. I will stand guard behind the bamboo and wait until the morning guard passes by and takes her safely to the nearby orphanage. The woman was very sad. She tied off the umbilical cord and helped the newborn with the cherub lips onto her milky nipple. When the child was sated and sleepy, the woman ran her finger around the edge of the child's lips to free her from the breast. Together, the parents wrapped the child in a warm cloth blanket, and the woman wept as her husband walked into the cool, dark night. She lit a blessing at the foot of Buddha and prayed for a better future for her second child. Then she climbed into bed with her son, who had slept right through the arrival and departure of his only sister. At dawn, her husband returned. They have found her, he said, and she is safe. And then, just a bit more, these two stories represent the fantasy of adoption, in which two needs are met in one action, the desire for a home for a child who cannot be homed, and the desire for a baby, a neat equivalence. And then I unpack this fictional equivalence and look at the complexity that I came to understand about what it might mean and how to adopt, and how there was this competition for overseas adoptions. So that was rather than beginning with the autobiographical that was how I approached the story.
Great.
So I think finding other forms. Rachel, what do you think?
I think that's a really great example of how you can write something about your own life with an ethical approach, because you're actually telling it in a way, you're using your writer's craft to tell it in a way that complicates things. So the biggest thing about ethics is that it complicates things. And so as a life writer, you're objecting to memoirs that are just sort of, taking advantage of someone's despair and writing that story. And I know what you mean, but I do think it's important that people of all sorts can tell their story, because we read to recognise others and to learn and not to be alone. And so that's important. So coming back to your point about ambivalence, which you so beautifully express in that poem that you read before, a biggest thing about relationships, and particularly mothering, but all relationships, is ambivalence. We love and hate someone at the same time. You really love your partner or your child, but sometimes they drive you crazy because they don't put the toothpaste back where you want it to be, or they don't tidy up when they make a mess. So that poem expresses that. Pretending that you never feel those angers towards someone else is just a pointless thing, because we're all human, and every reader will recognise that you love your son, but also sometimes we get angry with people. So I think that's the role of life writing, is that it allows us to see the complexity and to recognise that we are like other people, like the writer. We have these complex range of feelings, and that's okay.
I think we have some time for the audience, and we can open up the floor to the audience now. Questions? Yes.
Thanks. I guess because you all spoke about women's writing and writing as women, and mentioned at various points kind of obstacles or issues with the way that women's writing has been received. So I was wondering if you could speak more about your own feelings about publishing, I guess, as a woman, or owning your writing as a woman with your name on the title page. If you've ever considered writing under, a male pseudonym or an ambivalently gendered pseudonym, or whether you think that your writing has been received a certain way because of your gender, and if that's changed over time.
Just speaking personally, I think my natural tendency for my personality would be to mask and hide myself. So I think it was really important for me personally to publish under my own name, just as a kind of claiming of space, although it makes me very nervous. Yeah, I wouldn't mind being J.K. Rowling, so.
And I guess for me, as my first book was about mothering my son, I really it would have been quite confusing to adopt a male name. I mean, Robertson. Yeah. But for ethical reasons, I changed the names of all the people and my son. I mean, not that he can't be tracked, he could, but he has a different surname to me. But I kept my own name. So I haven't thought about doing that, but I have to say that I am a very late published author. So my first book, I mean, I had short pieces, but my first book didn't come out till I was 49. So that's I think if I'd been much younger, maybe I would have thought about some of those things. And certainly if I was publishing fiction or poetry, I may have thought about that. I don't know. I don't see how now you could maintain the sort of anonymity of that for very long, but it might be a useful thing for some women, I know.
Well, so far I can only work on publishing academic papers, but I'm really hoping to publish creative writing. And if I can really do that, I certainly will publish in my own name.
Talking about publishing at a rather late age, I think you also mentioned Australian writer Liz Bursky, who's the previous director of Curtin. She's a great and prolific writer. She's not only a woman writing about female experience, but also a woman writing about Asian woman experience. And she mentioned 4 years ago, I think, in a lecture at Fudan, that it has been more or less a blank in Australia. I'm just wondering, has the status quo changed over the years, or is still writing about one's experience as an Asian, not just woman, but also man, like Asian person or aged person? Is that more visible now, or has more authors been part of it? And how about readers?
Thanks for that question. Yes, our colleague Liz Bursky probably created and then started filling a niche in Australian publishing, which was well-written, popular fiction that featured characters, particularly women, who were over 50 initially and now over 60 in many of her books, who have lives. They travel, they work, they have sex, they have excitement, they also have despair, and more recently her books feature a character with dementia and one with Parkinson's. And so she has really now written a series of, I think, is it 8 books or 10 novels that, and her audience sort of is aging with her, and some of her characters, they're also quite diverse. So she has an Indigenous characters and characters who are child migrants and so on, and younger characters too. I think she's still one of the major writers in that field in Australia. I don't think there are still a lot of books that are accessible to the general reader around with ageing protagonists. I think there are some, and Josephine's work, of course, Extinctions, has, well, not a very old, but, you know, not a young protagonist. There are a lot of middle-aged memoirs, you know, fat 50 and or whatever. Perhaps it's not quite that, but people in what we would call middle age, but not so many older. So I think it's still a gap that is yet to be filled, you know, and Liz is really a leader in that field. I mean, that's my understanding. I'm happy to be questioned on that, or for other people to have other views, Australians here in the audience. Thank you.
Just, yeah, quick. My character in my novel is a retired professor of engineering, and his wife has died, and he's a collector of modernist. He's a collector and a hoarder, and a keeper of beautiful things. But his relationship is sort of mediated by objects, not by his relationship to objects, not people. But my book is called Extinctions, and it does explore. I think I'm trying to remember the piece at the beginning. I'm going to forget it. But, you know, this idea that everyone deserves a significant ending is really one of the ideas that I really feel strongly about. And, you know, I think I can remember that, you know, we've had lots of crises around refugees and drownings in Australia. And I can remember, and in Europe, as you know, I can remember reading one of those horrific stories about, you know, the boat that's been overturned and there's floating bodies and there's these bodies and no one knows their name and no one will ever name them. And this idea that you know, there's so many people in the world who don't have a significant ending. And I don't mean like a glamorous ending or like you're a hero, but just to be named and buried and marked and remembered. And I think that was also a really big part of my feeling around the book.
I'd like to ask a question to Ms. Wilson. When you were talking about how the experience is, I get to imagine like the biblical order when I thought about the the Exodus, when the prince come up to the Niles and then they watch. So, and also there's another cartoon types of The Simpsons. They also have an episode about come to China, adopting children and kind of stuff. Similar thing, but that one make it kind of fun. But the other one is kind of like when you say about the mother behind the Nile, see the child safely. Yeah, and that kind of way. So one is kind of like sad, and the other one kind of like more joyful things. And so I'm one child, by the way, and then coming from. Since I was in West Australia, I found out that West Australia has so much influences, especially first female from Fremantle, Miss Edith Cowan, during the suffragette movement, and they make a great impact.
These are names of institutions, Edith Cowan and significant female politicians, that the names of the universities and the institutions are named after significant female figures in history or politics.
And now we are in the era of Me Too movement, rather than we call previously the suffragette is called the feminism 1.0. And then the 70s is 1.5, and now it's 2.0. So how you think about that ways into the writing, because lots of female writers, they're writing the stuff about their traumas, their bullies, and then they've been hurt. So they're writing, through the writing, they silently expression about the oppression afterwards being published. And people say, wow, this is kind of like outspoken, but in the beginning, the motivation is that they've been hurt. Even though I'm a man, so I can't tell from the female perspective, but this is most of the writers they write, like Toni Morrison and like The Bull's Eye, all those stuff. They were kind of like, when we read a story, we feel pretty sad, but because you guys make us feel quite, it's okay, it's just story, so.
That's a big thing. Big thing. I think one of the most interesting things about the Me Too is that, you know, one of the, if in Australia and Europe, we've had a long history of feminist activism around things like the laws around rape, sexual abuse, many discrimination in the workplace. Not all of them are but there are laws in place, and the problem has been, you know, the experience of going through the law. For example, if you're raped, for a woman is very traumatic. It's a repetition, one might say, sometimes of the trauma. So we have now with the Me Too this very outside, extra institutional movement, which might take place online and through networks. And, you know, in China, I'm sure you have Baidu and WeChat, you know, whatever. You have these ways of communicating about what's happening. But they may be like floating above or below the official discourse and the official laws. And this is probably the same in Australia to a degree. And I think that's probably, I don't really know, I don't have much to say because I don't know what I think. I mean, but I do think that, you know, the channels that we have of communication are often very effective, but I worry sometimes that we need to impact and touch and connect with the kind of official channels or the law, or ways that people can be brought to actually be brought out publicly and people can understand that this kind of behaviour cannot be tolerated, and you will go to jail or you will lose your job, and that is the right thing, and it's supported by everybody, not just this kind of Twitter, the underground kind of connections.
Well, yeah, I think young women of our generations are more aware of rights issue, and we are more aware of the body issue. So what I would say is that while I totally agree with Josephine saying that we need to have more awareness raising, also more law or policy making to protect women in such circumstances, we also need to examine our culture, to examine or even purge from our culture the notion that the kind of shame or guilt we bear on our body, and especially once it is violated, we often probably instinctively put the blame onto ourselves, because our culture would encourage, or probably there are double standards in terms of how women can express themselves, how men are allowed to express themselves, and when the two criteria come into collide, what would happen? So definitely we have to encourage a sense of mutual respect, and in terms of the issue of body and the expression of one's privacy or one's own, you know, boundaries, it is necessary that it's necessary that we update our notion when it comes to social etiquette and when it comes to social behaviors.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add there, except to say we need to all take responsibility for our own actions and also for our words. So if we do write or publish about things, whether it's on Twitter or whether it's in a book, we take responsibility for those words as well as for our actions, and that's what I think, you know, that's the best we can try and remind each other of.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Now, shall we say to be continued? Please join me in thanking our three very enlightening and enriching, invigorating speakers and writers and critics. Thank you for your
Sorry, I have just one word to add to wrap it up. This is the last activity of the 5-day China-Australian Writing Center Symposium, and this is the director just sent me a message to add, so I'm the vice director. I forgot to mention that. So this is the CAWC, C-A-W-C, is a bi-party and also bilingual creative writing center based in Curtin University of West Australia in Perth, led by Dr. Lucy Dugan here, and also based in Fudan University, Shanghai. The current director is Professor Jiang Lingjing and myself. So next year we hold actually a series of activities, not just solely on creative writing, as we've seen perfectly in today's panels. It is a combination of creative writing, research, translation. So a lot of research combined with personal experience, and we very look forward to the ongoing events in the years to come. So next year, next symposium will be held, I think, in Fremantle, Australia. So if you are interested, come to Australia to be part of our next event. And thank you all very much. And thank you, Jida Bookstore, for holding this event for us. That's wonderful. And thank you, everyone, for being a part of our audience today. Thank you. Thanks.